To you, peace to you. It is Wednesday, June 28th, and we are looking at chapter 8 of Dr. Langberg's book, Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church. And this chapter is about the intersection of race and power. And I found the approach to this chapter to be interesting. It was unique. Dr. Langberg doesn't really talk about the specific dynamics between the abuse of power and race. She just, in other words, she doesn't try to explain that it exists or prove that it's true. What she does is she focuses more on the long term effects of how power abused in racial relations, the power that the effect that has had on others and people throughout time. Okay, and so what she does specifically is she describes and defines the trauma that is associated with a generations of abuse of power and race and racial issues. So, for example, she talks about a story about Celia, the slave, who was purchased by a man named Robert Newsom at the age of 14. And she talked about the abuses that she went through and everything else. And then she talked about how the effect of that abuse of power, right, which it is a clear example of abuse of power to buy somebody. He bought her at the age of 14 to use her as a replacement for his wife who had died, and so he, used her as kind of a concubine and a slave and a servant for his already born children. Ended up having three children with her, and so the kind of thing is power that is used to control and manipulate and dominate another person simply because of their skin color, right? So it's similar to everything we've discussed before. The reasoning behind it, the reasoning behind the abuse of power is based on skin color, and you have to go into history and look at people like Aristotle, who taught that dark skinned people were burned by the sun and were barbarians, and so they were lesser forms of human beings than others, and so we have the right, the ability, the capability to go ahead and dominate them and use them however we want to use them, right? So that's like the history behind the thinking that led to the slavery that we have in our history books here in the United States. But again, she doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on that stuff or exactly the dynamics between or what causes a power dynamic between races. She talks about the trauma that kind of abuse causes over generations. So she defines trauma this way. It's on page 112. Trauma is a wound to personhood, to the self, a deep wound with a profound impact. Okay. And then she continues on and she talks about what's been discussed or called or labeled the intergenerational transmission of trauma. She said this phrase refers to trauma that occurred several generations ago and its impact on each new generation psychologically, neurobiologically, and culturally. So let's break that down. She's saying that all the trauma that has happened over the years, over the time, over the centuries even, that has been rooted in racial dynamics, right? Someone being a different skin color and saying, okay, that person is somebody that I can now abuse them or I can abuse because my skin color is different and I have my reasons to dominate them, so on and so forth, right? Whatever the mindset of these people are that do that kind of thing. That abuse of power creates trauma in the individual, and again, any kind of abuse of power is going to do that. But think about how this specific kind of abuse of power is so widespread, right? You had millions of slaves that were brought over here, and then they had their children and their children. And so you have to think about the long term effects, right? Oh, slavery was so long ago. All right, it's true, relatively speaking, in our lives, right? It's 2023. It ended in the 1860s, so it's 200 or 160 years ago. feels like a really long time, right? But then you have to look at Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff and realize, well, that wasn't that long ago, but still maybe like, it's been 60 years of Voting Right Acts and all that kind of stuff. So why can't people just get over it? And the reason why they don't just get over it, because of this concept called intergenerational transmission of trauma, where even if that happened, if the last lynching was in the 1940s, I believe is the number, and just you have the last known recorded lynching, right? You have 60 years since the Voting Rights Act and all that kind of stuff, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and all that kind of thing is going on, and desegregation of schools and all that stuff. You feel like it's been long enough. Why can't people just get over it? Why does everything have to be about race now? We have to understand. We have to understand. You have to understand. I have to understand that the trauma endured by those people so many years ago, whether it was 200 years ago during slavery, 160 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 40 years ago, or even 10 years ago, that trauma passes down from generation to generation, and it affects people psychologically. It affects the way they think, the way they perceive the world, the way they behave. It affects them biologically. That means it's actually having an effect on people's brains and the development of the brains and the way that their brains function in this world. And it affects them culturally, right? The way that people live, the way that people um, uh, the way that people eat, the way that people worship, the way that people do any kind of thing. For an example, for worship, I took a church history in America class as an elective while I was working on my degree. And the professor explained to us the development of the AME churches, African Methodist Church, and how that started and how all that kind of stuff. And then he talked about how church services during slavery were the only time during a week where black people could be alone, be away from their masters. It was the only time they could be gathered together. They were allowed to go to church services, right? And people make these jokes all the time. I just saw a comedian on TikTok last night. It was like he was on America's Got Talent. This is one of these clips where he's talking about differences between white churches and black churches, and how white churches are to the point, they're short, they're sweet, they get the message done, the music is meant to be soothing and calming and all that kind of stuff. And then how black churches go on for hours and it's so intense and everything else. And the professor explained to us that during slavery, again, this was the only time they would spend together during a week. So, if you're going to church on Sunday and it's the only time you're away from your masters and away from working, all that kind of thing, like, what are you going to do? You're going to have reports. You're going to have, okay, to let everybody talk. Like, yeah, you know what? I heard my mother was sold to a slave of a plantation over there. Does anybody have news on them? Oh, yes, I know who that is. I know that they're okay, and so on and so forth. Or I know they're not okay. And sharing the news. Oh, so and so died. And if they got reports of people dying during the week, then it would turn into a funeral service also, because that was the only time that they could meet together like that. They weren't allowed to have funeral services during the week. If someone died, like, oh, it's master's like, oh yeah, go ahead and have a funeral service. No, that was their time. So it's why they would meet for hours on a Sunday, and it's why even today African American churches can go on for 2, 3, 4 hours, because it's part of their culture. How did it become part of the culture? It was part of the abuse of power and slavery that had been put on them, and the trauma resulting from that, right? And so we have to understand, as Dr. Langberg talks about, we have to understand the effects long term that the intersection of race and power and abuse have had on people, and how that effect happens and still exists today, and it looks as trauma. And so she explains on page 113, a person is altered and shaped by chronic complex trauma and oppression. The impact is mistrust, hopelessness, shame, inferiority, with no sense of ability or choice. This person has no sense of self or identity and no integrity of the self. They are isolated with no experience of love, no safety in relationships, no sense of purpose except perhaps survival. Despair, hopelessness, and lack of purpose are predominant. Okay? Those are all the long term generational effects that trauma can have on a person. And you add into the fact that you have a whole race of people, a whole group of people, right? I actually don't believe in concept of race. Like I believe we're one human race. We have diversity, we have ethnicities, we have cultures, but skin color doesn't determine that we're a different race of species, right? We're all same human beings. But just that idea that a whole subgroup of people, or a whole people group, I should say, whole people group has been affected, right? And multiple people groups are affected over time, generationally. There is trauma, and so it's under something to understand. Now, we can see this concept played out in Scripture. Actually, we return to a little bit of Scripture and a little look at study here. So I'm in John chapter 4, very famous passage. I've mentioned it a few times in previous broadcasts, and it's about the Samaritan woman at the well with Jesus. So it's chapter 4, verse 9 says, Then the Samaritan woman tells him, How is it that you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? For Jewish people don't deal with Samaritans. Yeshua replied to her, If you knew the gift of God and who it is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would give you living water." What I want to do is focus on that phrase that's in the parentheses. So that's something that's an aside added by the author. Says for Jewish people don't deal with Samaritans. Other translations say that Jewish people don't associate. The Greek word there, it's around that. It's like don't deal, don't associate, don't have anything to do with Samaritans. Okay. Now, what's the history of that? To know that, you go back to First Kings, around chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13, where you have there is King Solomon is ruling over a united Israel, but because of his sin, it was prophesied that he was going to lose his kingdom, right? And that his kingdom was going to be divided once he was dead. That God was going to wait till he died, but then for his children, it was going to be divided, and the nation was going to be divided uh, through a man named Jeroboam. Now, once Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became the leader of Israel, the king of Israel. He was anointed king. When he died, Jeroboam, who already had conflict with Solomon, had run away, I believe, to Egypt. When he heard that Solomon died, he came back. He took it as his opportunity. And the people complained to Rehoboam. They're like, man, can you relax us? Because your dad worked us hard for taxes and for money. And if you know the story, like Israel grew into this wealthy nation. Well, how do wealthy nations grow? You work the people, you tax them, and all that kind of stuff, right? So they were asking for a break. And Rehoboam, it says that he asked his elders what he should do. They advised that he should take it easy on the people and relax them, show them that that he's kinder than his son, than his father. His younger advisors, he asked them. They said to be tougher, show them you're stronger than your dad. And he went along with his younger advisors. And then Jeroboam came in and took advantage of the unrest and was able to pull away 11 of the 12 tribes, or I should say, so like 10 of the tribes. I think half the Levites or something like that went with him to the north to centralize their worship in the northern part of Israel. Okay, and by the way, the moral of that story wasn't to pay attention to your elders. The moral of the story was the king did not at any point ask God himself what he should do, and that's what he should have done. He should have asked God for advice, and he just listened to people and he chose. He chose. Uh, Now, when Jeroboam did that, he pulled the people north. He pulled a bunch of the tribes north. 10 tribes, I believe, 10, 11 tribes. I forget what the prophecy was. Forgive me, I didn't read uh, review that material specifically. But what who stayed in Jerusalem was the tribe of Judah. And what he did was he established worship of Jehovah up in the mountains. And how he did that was he created altars. The reason why he did that is because he didn't want the people to go back to Jerusalem for the festivals, which they have to do. They have 3 pilgrimages every year that they have to do. Although I guess back then it would have been 2, because one of those pilgrimages now is the festival of related to Esther. But anyway, I think I'm wrong on that. But anyway, I believe it's 3 pilgrimage, and so he didn't want them to go back to Jerusalem. That's the point. Forgive me. And that's the point. So he didn't want them to go back. So he's like, we're going to establish worship here in the mountains and with these altars, and you're going to worship Jehovah here, right? And so That's what he did. And then eventually they were worshiping idols and they were really into it. And so the Assyrians came. God allowed the Assyrians to come, and they conquered. And the way that Assyrians conquered was they didn't like to just dominate a people and rule over them and tax them. They like to assimilate with them because they felt like, hey, let's go in, we'll mingle, we'll take their women, we'll take their men, their wife, we'll mix it all up, and we'll just become one nation. So the Syrians, like, that way in a generation's time, you're like, oh, my kids are mixed, they're Syrians, and you don't fight against the rule, right? So that's the way they conquered, and it was a smart approach. And from that mingling and all that stuff that was going on is where you get the Samaritan people. Okay. And that's why and so with the Samaritan people, so over time, then when the Babylonians, so it took like another 100 and something years before the Babylonians conquered Judah. And then when the Babylonians came, they didn't do the intermingling thing. They did do, like, we'll take the best of you, we leave the rest of you there to work the land, to tax you, like the best of them, like Daniel, that kind of stuff. And eventually everybody returned. Jerusalem was rebuilt, the temple was rebuilt. But now in the northern kingdom, for centuries, you've had people who are just mixed blood that used to be just the Jewish people, but now they're mixed with the Assyrians and everything else, and whoever else might have been in there. And so those who remained Jewish by heritage, because they didn't intermingle like that, they started to look down on the people of the north. And this account here, it's centuries later. Okay, so we talked about the effects of race and power and abuse in America, and it's only a couple hundred years of that effect, 300 years or whatever, 400 years, 1619. So we have that history, and but for the Jewish people, it was even longer. Okay, and what we have then is a society which is divided based on race, based on a perception of race. And like I said in verse 9, it says, "For the Jewish people they don't associate with Samaritans." It's such a strong position that this woman is surprised that Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, which she can tell because of the way he's dressed, and they had ways of distinguishing each other from each other, even though he was in their territory. She's like, "How could you ask me for a drink? You know, how could you ask me for a drink of water? It doesn't make any sense. You're a Jewish person. I'm a Samaritan. Like, you're supposed to be the kind of person that's like, I'm gonna have nothing to do with you." Literally, we're both sitting at this well. She expected him to just ignore her. That's what she expected. That's what she was used to. That's what she's had passed down to her. Right? Read that earlier. The effects of chronic complex trauma and oppression. The impact is mistrust, hopelessness, shame, inferiority, with no sense of ability or choice. A person has no sense of self or identity, no integrity of self. They're isolated, no experience of love, no safety in relationships, no sense of purpose, except perhaps survival. And so for her, that's all of that is in there inside of her. It's trauma. It's we were conquered by another group of people. It's not like we had a choice. It's not like we were like, okay, hey, yeah, let's intermingle. Let's do this. Hey, Northern Kingdom of Israel, like, you heard about these Assyrians. Let's call them up and say, let's have a big party. Let's become one people. They didn't do that by choice. They were forced to do that, and that's trauma. And that trauma now has been passed down for generations and generations and generations, to the point where now we have Jesus speaking to someone, just asking for a drink of water, and because of her trauma, this is her reaction. Like, how could you ask me for a drink of water? And the main takeaway from all this is Jesus's interaction with her. Uh, and so he continues on, and I read that earlier, verse 11. He asks for a living for water, and he offers living water, and she says, "Sir, you don't have a bucket. The well is deep. Then from where do you get this living water? You're not greater than our father Jacob, are you? He gave us this well. He drank out of it himself and with his sons and his cattle." And so she's going into those concepts that are rooted in the minds of Samaritans because of all the trauma they've gone through. They've gone through this oppression and trauma, this message that they're not true Jews, but they have their own history, and they call back to Jacob, and she's like, "Look, this well is one that was dug by Jacob himself." And the reason why they identify with that is because they want to show others like this is ours, like he is our father, we are Jewish people, right? Just the fact that she's bringing that up to him. And I really want to say this because he's talking about something spiritual, she's talking about something physical. And why does it happen? Because that's where the responses go. It's like, hey, this is Jacob's well, right? It's in her mind. And then he continues to talk about the spiritual water. She understands in verse 13, and she says, "Give me this water." And that's when he confronts her about her lifestyle, what she's been doing, that she has been with more than one man, and that the person that she's currently with is not even her husband. And she perceives then in verse 19, "I see that you're a prophet." Right? So now she has a question. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, right? Talking about Jeroboam and all that, how it was established. But you all, the Jewish people, say that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. She's asking, where do we worship? And he answers her and says, "Woman, believe in me. The hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You will worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and is here now, when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people as worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." And look, notice what he does there. You got to understand also the gentleness on this approach, right? He related this all to water, and then he's talking to her about this living water, and then she brings up this whole question about worship, and he corrects her and says, "Listen, this whole thing about you guys worshiping in the mountains, I know you're very defensive about it. There's a lot of trauma there because of the way everything was divided, the way the kingdom started, and then the Assyrians came, and you lost your kingdom, you lost your identity, and you're trying to hold on to that, and you're trying to understand it, and the Jewish people now are telling you that you're not really Jewish people, and if you want to be Jewish people, you have to worship in Jerusalem and not this mountain." And he says, "Listen, it's not supposed to be this mountain." He gently points it out, like, that is wrong. Okay. But a time is coming, and actually that time is now, where you don't have to go to the temple and worship as the Jewish people are telling you you have to do, because worship is going to be allowed to happen anywhere, because what God is really looking for is people who worship in spirit and truth. And what's interesting there to me is just psychologically speaking, and understanding mental health and stuff like that. Someone who's been through generational trauma, like this woman has, like anyone who's been experiencing trauma on a large scale, even on a smaller scale, like if it's PTSD due to rape, or someone's gone to war, that trauma can also be passed on generationally, right? We're talking here about race because it's the content of the chapter, but also understand, like I said earlier, you have a much wider group of people who are all experiencing the same trauma at the same time, the same kind of oppression. And this one woman is an example of that, an example of an entire, you can call them nation of people who've been traumatized because of oppression. Another nation came in and then intermingled with them, again, not by their choice. And then after generations of that, then when everybody gets reunited, then they're being told they're not really Jews, or Jewish people. They're not really of the same heritage, because now they've been mixed because of something they didn't have a choice of. They're mixed blood, and they're dirty, and they're not, they're worshipers of other gods. And so what they got to do is basically they got to convert to Judaism. They have to go to the temple, they have to do the sacrifices. And it's just, but our father was Jacob. Like, this is his well, this is where we live, like this is us. And so it's like, where am I? That sense of identity is lost, right? Just notice how gentle he is in restoring that to her. He points out her error. He has two errors. She's been sleeping with multiple men, and that's problematic for Jesus. And she's been worshiping a God that she doesn't know truly, but now she's getting to know him. Now she's getting to know him. And you see caked into it, and he explains, like, "I'm the one, I'm speaking to you." Because they had a promise of a Messiah too. The Samaritan Jews did. If you watch, my series on the 7 I am statements and the 7 miracles of Jesus, the Gospel of John, you'll see that the Gospel of John is most probably written for Samaritan Jews, for them to understand the salvation that Jesus came to speak to them too, that it's for them as well. That's why this story is so central to the Gospel of John. In verse 27, his disciples came back and they were amazed that he was speaking with a woman, yet no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" So here it's like a whole other thing. Not only is she Samaritan, she's a woman, and as a rabbi, he's talking to a woman. Another way that generational trauma can affect somebody. We talked about that yesterday, and just the whole power and systems between men and women, and how that's also passed down. That trauma of being oppressed and having power used against you just because of your gender is an issue as well. And they have that same mindset. They're thinking the same thing. They're like, "Oh, why is he talking to a woman?" And that just that way of thinking is sinful, and it's oppressive, and it communicates and supports the idea that women are not supposed to be spoken to by rabbis. They shouldn't be having time alone with them, and then let alone she's a Samaritan woman. Like, what are you doing, Jesus? But it says that no one had the courage to say anything to her, and so because of that, she goes and because no one said anything to her, like, "Hey, get out of here, leave. What are you talking to me?" He's like, "Oh, okay. Let me go to the town and get more people." And so they all come out and they meet, and you see the whole interaction there that Jesus has with the people. What I want to know again is how Jesus interacts with this one person who's been through this generational trauma, oppression based on race, how he gently meets with her, promises her something that he knows he can offer, first of all, and that's something she needs. She wants it. He corrects her about some of the things that she needs to be corrected about. And her response is acceptance. Her response is belief. These are the only people in the Gospel of John, besides the disciples, that don't need extra proof or extra teaching to believe in who Jesus is. They don't need it. They straight up believe. They don't need miracles, I should say. They don't need signs that he is the Messiah. They basically just hear what he has to say. Even Nathaniel, the beginning of the Gospel of John, is doubtful that Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus tells him how he saw him standing under a fig tree, and that's a sign. That's a miraculous thing. Like, it's a sign that he's a Messiah. So he's doing something that no ordinary human could do, telling you where you were before you could even see him. And that's when Nathaniel believes that he's the Son of God. He's the King of Israel. These people don't need any of that. He doesn't perform any miracles here. All he does is he talks. And it's a special thing. It's a special concept in the Gospel of John because it shows us, it distinguishes, hey, these are the lowest of the lows in our community, these Samaritan Jewish people. They've been oppressed for years. And look how Jesus goes to them. Look how Jesus goes to them and shares with them this message, and look how they believe. And I think about, we talked about earlier, how different races in America and the black culture and church and everything else, and where that originates from. But you look at how we treat each other in the faith, and it tells us more about our faith than anything we can ever say. Okay. I learned a little while ago that in the state of Virginia, during slavery there was a huge commotion about whether or not slaves should be set free once they become believers, once they get baptized, because now they're Christians. What do we do? We're supposed to be brothers in Christ. There was actually a debate about that, and they actually passed laws to protect owners from losing slaves because of conversion. They allowed them to hold on to it. They had this rationalization about baptism and all this kind of stuff. It's really wild. Like, you bring slaves over here, you torture them and all this kind of stuff, you rape them, you separate their families, all the terrible stuff with slavery. Then at the same time, they're hearing the gospel preached at them in a way that's just oppressive. Like, they read like Paul and say, "You have to obey your slaves," or your master, excuse me. But they hear the gospel of that, and then somehow they get saved through it. And then there's a debate as to whether or not I should set them free. Not what Jesus did at all. Jesus went to those who were lost. Jesus went to those who were oppressed. Jesus went to those that people thought they were less than them. It's one of the main problems that the Pharisees had and the leaders had with him. They're like, "Why are you hanging out with those marginalized, oppressed, dirty people, those sinners, those tax collectors, those Samaritans, the prostitutes. What are you doing? And that's why when you look at our society, and George Floyd was like, his death was such a monumental point in our history. I believe we're going to look back on it and say, and talk about the things that have changed because of that event. And I know for me, it has helped me to see how some churches and some pastors and some people in their teaching are just not worth listening to. But because when it comes to righteousness and it comes to doing to what is fair and what is good and what is just and what is merciful, they would rather hold on to their power. We see that in the government and decisions that are being made, and so on and so forth. And you're realizing more and more that partisan politics is not the answer. The church the true community of Jesus needs to rise up and be like he is. And that's actually one of the main focuses in this chapter, in the intersection of race and power. The restoration of beauty, she called it in the section here, and she also calls it healing generational trauma. And just the idea that, and then she talks about sitting with trauma. So she has three sections in a row. It's restoration of beauty, healing generational trauma, sitting with trauma. And so what Dr. Langberg wants us to understand, what I believe she wants us to understand, is the long-term effects that racial oppression and power and abuse have had on people of color in this country, and specifically the Black community, those who have history in slavery, how that effect has lasted over generations, and how we need to seek to restore their beauty. We need to see that there are things in their culture that may be the result of trauma that they are they're in. And as a church, our responsibility is to go to them and to meet them where they are, and to supply them with what they can use. Like Jesus offered living water to this woman. What are we offering to these people? What are we offering to them that they need? And in offering that to them, we're sitting with them. Jesus offered living water to this woman. He was sitting with her. He was having a conversation with her. And that's what's missing. It's easy to come up with programs and here's money and here's support and all this stuff. And I think all of that stuff is necessary. I myself, our family, we relied on those what is it, EBT and food stamps and stuff. We relied on that. My mom, single mom, she needed that help. Okay, I'm not talking about taking that away. I'm talking about the church saying, okay, the government's doing that, but what are we doing? Are we going to these communities? Are we sitting with them? Are we talking to them? Are we hearing their stories of rage and anger and talking about the love of God, and how they can forgive and find forgiveness in God, and how they can heal from the trauma? Providing counseling services? Are we providing support? Are we looking at homes that have messed up yard and saying, "Oh, look at them and see how they make the yard"? Or are we just going to go out there and knock on the door and say, hey, "Is it okay if I cut your grass for you?" And to serve them and to see that there's someone living in the house that they're just not able to go out there and cut the grass, or they don't have a lawnmower and they can't afford someone to do it for them. And so we serve them. We serve the community. We ask them, do you need us to paint your house? Do you need work? Like, are we a community that's going out and meeting people where they are, and at the same time offering them, as we have conversations with them and having those opportunities, are we then offering them the living water that Jesus offered the woman at the well? Understanding again the generational trauma that has been passed throughout the centuries to people because of the abuse of the abuse that was projected towards them and done to them simply because they were a different skin color. And so I think that's the main concept here in her chapter. It's really what she focuses on. She focuses on the trauma and the fact that we're created in the image of God, and how that's been marred and scarred and everything else, and then how what racial trauma does and how it affects generation. And she talks about Jesus, Samaritan woman, and she closes with this idea of sitting with people. And so I think that's the intersection of race and power that we need to understand, and the long term effects of that. So, and thank you for watching. I hope this again was a blessing. If there are any questions, comments, things I need to clarify, please let me know. You can reach out to me on all my social media. I've cleared up all my DMs and Facebook, so you can even use that now. I used to have like hundreds of messages there from just random people, and so I would just ignore it. But now I'm there. You can message me there. You can message me on Instagram. I got Twitter, got TikTok. All the links are available on my website, thayil.thoughts.com. That's THAYIL thoughts.com. And like, subscribe, share with people that you think will enjoy this kind of stuff. Tomorrow, we will be looking at chapter 10, and chapter 10 is a big one. It is power abused in the church. Power abused in the church. Thank you. God bless.